Hello, and we are back for the reading of Chapter 9. Streets of white stone twisted through homes buried between Lorlenalin's towers. The late morning sun that bathed the city in streaks of orange vanished among the dark alleys and winding side streets. From beneath a black hood, Kallan peered through the grim lane. She didn't see the unusual blackness that twisted its way through the valley behind her. It stopped when she stopped, and moved again when she pulled her cloak tighter and continued through the maze of back streets. Her feet slapped the stone, adding an articulated footfall to the silence. Behind her, the shadow loomed. The Sidcona descended a collection of small steps and turned into a darker passage where frequent clusters of weathered gray planks augmented the drab of Lorlenalin's warrens. Walls loomed over her, forming a labyrinth of gorges from towers built too close together. At the end of the narrow alley, a small door, fashioned out of warped planks and held together with fraying twine, leaned against a dilapidated frame. The Sidcona pulled at a rusted bracket, bent and turned upside down. The shadow watched and waited as the aged makeshift handle rattled in her grasp. The door hinge whined and shifted. The last of the nails had come loose again. Without hesitation she slipped through the small doorway and descended an immediate 3 steps into the ground, and the shadow descended too, seeping its way down the steps behind her. Broken barrels, weathered planks, and graying scrap wood from the docks filled the small room. A serpentine path wound its way through the maze of wood. In the far corner near the back of the wall, the tallest of towers obstructed the path from view. With a flick of the Sidcona's wrist, blue scythe light burst from her hand and formed a hovering orb that lit the room. The shadow swelled and wove itself in between the planks and barrels, spilling in and around the room's natural darkness, where it concealed itself just as the Sidcona gazed over her shoulder. Blue light touched her pearl-white skin, accenting her high cheekbones and delicate jaw. She scanned the room as her hand moved to the sword at her waist. The air was thick. The shadow waited. Her grip tightened on her hilt when, from behind the tower of broken barrels, a boy emerged and charged the Sidcona. He swung his stick high in the air and ululated his best battle cry. Kallan released her hilt and raised her palm where silver blue scythe flowed, forming a shield. At once Kallan drained her strength into the sage shield. By the time the boy brought his stick down into Kallan's ward, the shadow was gone. "Oh!" The boy's shoulders fell and he pushed out his bottom lip. "I wanted to duel!" "Ger," Kallan said, "I am not going to raise my sword to you. Stop trying." "You're scared I'll beat you," Ger said. His head almost reached her waist. "You know what?" Kallan flicked her finger, sending a speck of scythe through the air, harmlessly striking his cheek. "Ah!" he cried. "That's a challenge!" He raised his play sword again. "Kallan?" A girl squealed and charged, fastening herself to Kallan's ankle. The child grinned through blemishes of dirt and tangles of blonde hair. Ger groaned and lowered his stick again. "I just accepted her challenge, Cree," he said, and slumped back off behind the barrels, dragging his stick behind him. With a smile, Kallan brushed back her hood and crouched down to the child attached to her leg. "Is Alef here, Cree?" she asked with a gentle grin. "He's in the back with Latha," Cree said, refusing to relinquish Kallan's leg. "Is his nose bleeding again?" The child nodded. Slipping her hand into the folds of her cloak, Kallan presented a green apple that filled her palm. "My leg for an apple?" Kallan said as the lantern light caught the white elding bracelet dangling at the end of her wrist. Intricate etchings of eternity knots and runes spanned the length of the jewel, but the apple alone drew Cree's eye. Bristling with joy, Cree released Kallan's leg. Snatching the apple, she bound their contract and sank her teeth into the fruit. With a flourish, Kallan pulled her cloak from her shoulders, revealing a large basket crammed with herbs, fruits, breads, and salted meats. Her long brown hair fell down her back, and after draping the cloak over the basket, Kallan held her hand down to Cree. "Let's go then," she said. On cue, Cree leapt from the floor and snatched Kallan's hand. Making their way around the barrels, Kallan came to a second door. This one was newer and stronger than the first, with proper hinges and a sturdy, shiny handle freshly nailed in place. Orange light poured from the cracks of the wood and streaked the shadows with a happy glow that seemed unnatural in this part of the city. Pushing open the door invited a flood of squeals and hullabaloo that accompanied a bombardment of minute alpha children swarming Kallan's feet. Over the sea of heads, Kallan scanned the wide, warm room laden with thick, lavish blankets and elegant furs. A large fireplace crackled beneath a soapstone cauldron that filled the home with the scent of stew. Piles of bedding were scattered about wherever there was room. Beside the hearth, the youngest child slept beneath her blankets. "Again?" Kallan called over the children's head to Alef, who stood pinching Latha's nose beside the only table in the room. Clad in his plain brown robes, the scribe peered beneath the rag held to the face of a lad sitting on the table. "Again," he said, leaving Kallan to free herself from the rabble. It took Kallan several insane minutes to quiet the children and disperse the crowd. Exclaiming, they huddled around her basket in the center of the room, and gleefully picked through Kallan's gifts as the princess tended to Latha's nose. "It looks like you've just lost some blood," Kallan said, and shrugged, shaking her head at Latha. "That's it." "Will it come back?" Latha asked, his brown eyes peering over the rag. "I don't know," Kallan said, and pulled a gold apple from the pouch fastened to her side. Unsheathing a dagger, she sank the blade into the apple's golden flesh. "Here." Kallan offered a slice, and heaving, lowered him to the floor. "You're getting big," she said, emphasizing a grunt. Now go take a look at the basket." The boy beamed as he scarfed down the apple slice and scurried off to find a place around the basket. Kallan was back on her feet when she felt a tug on her blue skirts. "Kallan?" Kallan crouched to the ground. "Yes, Rind?" she asked, a girl no more than 3 winters old, appearing too small for her age, and with eyes larger than her starved, sunken face seemed to be able to hold. Rind wrapped her arms around Kallan's neck and snuggled her face into the Sitkona. Grinning, Kallan stood, taking the girl with her. "How did Father and Dagon's clothes work out?" Kallan asked Elif, as Rind shoved a thumb into her mouth and plopped her head down on Kallan's shoulder. "Perfect," Elif said, fascinated by the children, who were currently shredding a loaf of bread into pieces. "I used most of them to replace some of the tunics. I also made trousers for the older ones who've outgrown their rags." "And Herdis?" Kallan asked, nodding to the sleeping girl, who had not awakened despite the commotion. "She's resting well enough now," Elif said. "Your concoction seemed to have worked. It brought the fever down and it broke this morning. The infection also seems to be clearing up. The smell is gone." Kallan nodded, hearing the relief in his voice. "It'd be easy if I were further into my studies," she said, detesting her own limits. "Another day and I would have taken her to Gudrun." "What about the food?" Elif asked. "Did Cook catch you this time?" "No." Kallan grinned. "I used a spell." Elif chuckled, bouncing his body with the rhythm of his laughter. "Don't laugh," Kallan said, smiling. "That spell has saved me more times than anything else I've learned." "I just remember Eric and Cook protesting that you not learn it for this very reason," Elif said, still chuckling. "Not this reason exactly," she said. "But one like it," Elif reminded her. "I like cloudberries," Kallan said, watching the last of the bread vanish as the children started on the fruit. "Besides, this is a good reason." As Elif's face split into a wide grin, the door opened, emitting a brief creak that drew Kallan and Elif's attention to Dagon, whose wide frame filled the doorway. His wild red hair spilled past his shoulders and into the wiry red beard that framed a pair of copper eyes. "Dagon?" Kallan said. "Yep," he said, and stepped aside. Behind him, Eyolf stood, as tall and as wide as Dagon, with a fur and hide coat that added to his size. "Father," Kallan said, as Elif bowed his head and genuflected. "Kallan," Eyolf said, and nodded to the scribe. "Elif?" "Stand down, princess," Dagon said, closing the door. His armor clinked and moved with him as he followed behind Eyolf, who walked around the children as if they had been Kallan's gowns strewn about her chamber floor while she played with spells and swords. "Still robbing cooks' kitchens?" Eyolf asked. With a scrunched brow, Kallan assessed the layer of chainmail Dagon and her father wore, then studied the swords secured at their sides. "You're armed," Kallan said. "I was told of no battle." A smirk pulled at the edge of Dagon's mouth as Eyolf took up Kallan's hands and planted a kiss to each. "Told you she would notice," Dagon muttered. "I'll pay you later," Eyolf said, not bothering to hide his remark. "What is that supposed to mean?" Kallan said, as Dagon scrutinized Gar's trousers that looked too much like a man's tunic. His tunic. "Still looking for a fight, Kallan?" Eyolf said. She flashed him her best smile. "Always." "Well, don't." He tried his best to scold her. "A woman of your age should be enjoying far more than just fighting." "You taught me little else," she beamed, and the firelight caught a gleam of mischief in her eye. "You're too old to care only for swords and battles," Eyolf said. "I care for other things," Kallan said. Elif stifled a bout of uncontrolled chuckling. "And you!" Eyolf peered at the scribe. "You shouldn't encourage her." "He doesn't encourage me, father," Kallan said, passing Rune to Elif. "He enables me." Elif took the child and carried her to the basket of goods where he could escape the talk that was due between Kallan and the king. "I'll ready the horses and leave you to your daughter," Dagon said, evoking a scowl from Eyolf. "What was that about?" Kallan asked, and her father shrugged. "Dagon wants me to marry you off to King Athelred of Engleland." Kallan flashed her best unimpressed look and took up her cloak from the table as the door closed behind Dagon. "You must have something of importance to discuss to track me to the warren," she said. "I did," Eyolf said, releasing her hands as he walked around the table to put distance between themselves and the children. "About?" Kallan said. "I'm marrying you off to the King Athelred of Engleland." There was silence, and the fire popped as Kallan felt the warmth drain from her face. Eyolf grinned. "I'm kidding." Kallan released her breath and attempted to smile back. "We just received word that King Rune is preparing another attack." "Again," Kallan said. "When do we leave?" "We don't." Kallan opened her mouth to argue. King Rune is growing more desperate, her father said before Kallan could intervene. The Norns have helped you this far. The Norns have nothing to do with it, Kallan said. I'm that good. Eyolf shook his head. I can't let you go, Kallan. But I'm good, Kallan said. You know this. I've never been wounded. Because you're not a target. Not yet, anyway. Once they catch on that the Sikona's apprentice is the king's daughter, the Dark One, that berserker will stop at nothing to get his hands on you. It's too dangerous. Kallan's shoulders fell with her spirits and mood, and she gazed at the children huddled about the basket. They've lost so much, she said. The least I could do is avenge their fathers for them. By taking their hate on for them, you hope to ease their suffering. Is that it? Eyolf asked and brushed Kallan's chin. She looked up at his old gray eyes, weathered from stress and war. I can't have you fighting alongside me anymore, he said. Don't follow. Not this time. Kallan nodded and lowered her eyes, but Eyolf caught her chin. Promise, he said. I promise. Eyolf kissed Kallan's brow and wrapped her in a warm hug. How long will you be at the keep? She asked into the firs. Most of the day, Eyolf said. I'll be back in time for sup. Kallan nodded. This is just a routine inspection. I need to make sure Thorold has the troops ready. They'll be our first defense when the attack comes. Besides, Eyolf peered down at Kallan, who looked up from the firs that tickled her nose. Don't you have a lesson today? Kallan's eyes widened. The forge. I forgot! With a hurried kiss to his cheek, she turned for the door, then stopped at the basket of food and the huddle of children. Hey, Gare! She called. Gare poked his head up just as Kallan flicked her finger. As before, a speck of gold sade flew through the air and harmlessly smacked Gare on the other cheek. Hey! Gare shouted, and was on his feet running for his sword. With a grin and a flourish, Kallan wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and glided toward the door in a sweeping display. The door closed with an impertinent click behind her. Hey, come back here! Gare called, and threw back the door. In short order, he followed behind her with his stick. Hell's gates, Elf muttered. From the floor, Eilif smiled. Kallan is who she is, your majesty. Eyolf watched the scribe tear apart a loaf of bread for Rind. You're not children anymore, Eilif, he said. If Kallan doesn't learn to expand her interests beyond orphans and swords and spells, I may just have to force the issue through marriage. Eilif respectfully nodded and passed Cree her own helping of bread. You have Kallan's respect more than any of us, Eyolf said. Perhaps you should do your part to encourage her proper behavior before I'm forced to find her a husband who will. Eilif looked up from the children. For her sake, Eilif, please. Eilif nodded to the king. Yes, my lord, he said, leaving Eyolf to his silent contemplations. Okay. Thank you very much, and tomorrow I will be reading chapter 10 and chapter 11. Ooh, okay. Thank you again very much, and I will see you then.